Good afternoon. Welcome to Lunch with Books. If you wouldn't mind turning your cell phones off this time, I'd appreciate it. Next week, April 4th, Brian Kammer will be here. He was a death row attorney in Georgia for several years, still in Georgia. He's originally from Wheeling, attended Lindsley, and he has done extensive research on redlining and urban renewal, which he will tell us about next week at noon on April 4th. And then on the 11th, the former Kentucky Poet Laureate, Frank X. Walker, will be here. He's the inventor of the idea of Affrilatia. And Mark Harshman, of course, is the organizer of that Wheeling Poetry Series. So that'll be on the 11th at noon. Today we have with us the Curator of Rare Books and Printed Resources in the West Virginia Regional History Center, Stewart Plein. This is the Special Collections Unit at WVU. She's also Director for the West Virginia National Digital Newspaper Project and the National Endowment for Humanities grant in partnership with the Library of Congress, which is funding the research she's going to tell you about today. The African American Press in West Virginia. Here is Stewart Plein. Make sure we get the microphone.
I'm a little on the short side, or have you noticed? Oh, that's great. Thank you. Well, the difference, Thank you, Sean. And I got to say, you're one of the very few people who has pronounced my last name correctly. So kudos to you. Well, it's not morning. Good afternoon, everyone. I am so excited to be here. I loved hearing everything that's coming after me. It's such an honor to be here. I have attended many virtual Lunch with Books sessions, so to be a part of this is great for me. I was just saying to Justin that I have seen Frank X. Walker a number of times and don't miss it. He is an amazing poet. The lineup for this program is really fantastic. So I'm so thrilled to be here. So let's get started. First of all, let me just get familiar with this computer. First of all, I want to start with a few acknowledgments. And the first one is to Crystal Good. She's the founder and editor of Black by God, the West Virginian. I don't know if you're familiar with that newspaper. She started it in 2020 in Morgantown. And Crystal is the one who introduced me to Sean Duffy here at the Ohio County Public Library, and Laura Carroll, who assisted in the research with me. And I learned about a new paper today, or just the other day, the Wheeling Post, that I did not know about because of her. So that was a thrill.
Could you speak closer to the mic?
Yes, absolutely. I think I'm right on top of it. Can you hear me? Yes. Good. Okay, so I'd also like to thank Crystal, who introduced me to historian John Mullins of Lost History Associates. He writes the Lion of Anacostia blog, and he discovered 6 of the early West Virginia newspapers, which he kindly shared with me. And Bethany Arbaugh at the State Archives. She's really helped me a lot with a particular newspaper, the West Virginia Enterprise, which I'll be talking about today. The other group of people I'd like to thank are the authors who came before me. So many great authors who wrote books at the time. Also, Armistead S. Pride. He is really what I consider the father of Black newspaper research. He was a scholar in the 40s and 50s, and that's when he did his original research on Black newspapers all across the United States, and he was really amazing. I've learned a lot from him, but most of all, I'd like to thank the NDNP, or the National Digital Newspaper Project. Without the support of the NDNP, which is funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Library of Congress, this would not be possible. We have WVU has had a grant since 2011, and I've been the director of that since 2013. And it's a wonderful program, and thanks to them, they have truly supported West Virginia's newspapers. So let's get on with the show. Okay. So, as you know, I'm here today to talk about one element of the Black experience in the state of West Virginia, and that is Black print culture, as it refers to Black-owned and operated newspapers. This presentation focuses on African American newspapers in West Virginia from the earliest paper appearing in 1881, the West Virginia Freeman, to the most recent, which is Black by God, the West Virginian by Crystal Good, founded in 2020. We'll be talking about 142 years of Black-owned and operated newspapers today. So I want to mention a note on the content. I'm blind, so I have to hold this up. I'm sorry. I can't. This is a 14 font, and I can't even read it. So please be aware that we are discussing these papers. We will be using terms that were acceptable at the time, but ones we don't use today. So when we began researching this topic at WVU back in 2015, that's when I decided that that grant proposal was going to focus on African American newspapers. At that time, we knew of 14 newspapers. By 2016, we found a couple more. When research began in earnest in 2022, we were astounded to find 40 Black-owned newspapers publishing in the state. At the present time, the total has risen to 48, and I think maybe 49 with the Wheeling Post here. Population was one of the driving forces for the proliferation of newspapers in the state. In 1880, the year prior to the first published Black newspaper, the population of Blacks in West Virginia was 25,800. By 1910, those numbers grew to 64,000, and by 1930, 115,000 African Americans resided in the state, mostly to work in coal mines, also the railroad. In comparison, today the population is 64,285 for a 2.8% of the West Virginia population as a whole. After 1888, the Black population in the state concentrated in the counties of the southern coal fields for work. McDowell, Mercer, Raleigh, Fayette, Kanawha, Mingo, and Logan had the highest populations. With the Black populations heavily centered in these counties, the greatest concentration of Black newspapers were also there. Charleston, the state's capital, was home to 11 newspapers. Although some papers, such as the Pioneer Press under editor J.R. Clifford, published for 30 years, most failed to thrive. Beset with a fluctuating subscriber base, the constant need for funds, and personnel shortages, African American newspapers in West Virginia during the 1880s to the 1940s struggled to survive. Many were short-lived, publishing issues for a couple of years at best, sometimes just months, sometimes just a year. Some papers found themselves shutting down production for weeks or even months at a time, waiting for subscribers and advertisers to provide enough funding to begin publishing again. As was often the case, few people could afford to subscribe, and issues were frequently passed from hand to hand, shared among family members and throughout the community. The act of sharing brought important news to a wider audience, but the lack of subscribers was nearly certain death for the publisher. Even as late as 1944, the editor of the West Virginia Digest, I.J.K. Wells, printed this plea to his readers. The West Virginia Digest, the people's paper, will no doubt appear infrequently because of labor shortage and help. It will not make its weekly schedule for some time. Because you fail to see it every week, don't think it's dead. The cause for which it stands cannot die, and because there is a need for a newspaper, this one or some other will spring up from time to time. That's really a very moving statement. It speaks to the longevity of Black newspapers and the need for it, but the difficulties in continually publishing a newspaper. Problems with lack of payment were perennial. A May 1920 issue of the Huntington Times was more direct. On the first day of June, your paper will be cut off unless you sent in your subscription. That's it, you're done. So operational needs and other concerns, including operational needs, especially in the early days, a broad level of education, advertisers to supply ready funds, and a printing operation, including the labor force to operate it and the materials and machinery to print the newspapers. With all of these things all together, it was really hard to maintain the printing of a newspaper. So here's Kanawha County. I've decided to separate these newspapers by county. I think that's sort of a clear way to see exactly where the newspapers are centered in the state. So in Kanawha County from 1884 to 2006, there were 11 African American newspapers published in the county. As you can see from this slide, there are gaps in our information. One of the newspapers, the West Virginia Enterprise, published by the Reverend Dr. CH Payne, will be digitized during the present grant cycle. The Advocate, published by a group of editors, the most prominent being J. McHenry Jones, has been digitized and is available to read and research now on Chronicling America. So here's J. McHenry Jones. Newspaper editors were also community leaders, and newspaper editors were amazing men, full of talent and drive and possibility, and J. McHenry Jones is no exception. More than one served their readers as ministers, as did Jones. Editors were also attorneys, educators, and politicians. As leaders, editors took strong stands on racism with topics that included political events, Jim Crow laws, unfair mine labor practices, civil rights, and the military, which often limited soldiers to positions of service. Newspapers advocated for education, community pride, party alliances that would benefit African Americans. Cultural activities, including church and social events, also filled their pages, as did articles provided by wire services, such as the Associated Negro Press and the all-important advertisements. J. McHenry Jones was one of these community leaders. Among his most important roles was as the first president of the West Virginia Colored Institute, which is now West Virginia State University. It still continues today. The Advocate published from 1901 to 1913. Jones, a community leader of high standing, was also the author of the novel Hearts of Gold, the first published by an African American in West Virginia. I'm very happy to say that the Rare Book Room has a first edition copy of Hearts of Gold. It's really a beautiful book, and it's digitized and readily available to read online if you have an interest in doing that. You can also come see me in the Rare Book Room, and I'll share it with you. Jones was a recognized orator. He served as a minister in the African Methodist Church and as a teacher and principal of the Lincoln School here in Wheeling prior to his term as president of the West Virginia Colored Institute. So surviving issues cover 1907 to 1912. Right up front, the Advocate didn't hesitate to make bold statements. One above the masthead reads, "The Advocate contains more news than any other race paper published." In addition, the paper stated, "The Advocate reaches more colored readers than any newspaper in West Virginia." These were bold claims to make, and competition was tough. The Advocate was one of 5 black newspapers published in the state at the time. At first, the Advocate, a weekly, ran a full 8 pages of news, which may explain why it states, beneath an ad for hair color titled, "You Look Prematurely Old," is this statement. Read every line in this paper and then decide whether or not it contains more real, live, race, and general news than can be found in any other weekly paper. Although the Advocate had a long run, 12 years, longer than most black newspapers, the paper's popularity wasn't to last. In just a few years, the Advocate decreased its length to 6 pages, changing its statement to, "We cheerfully publish all crisp news notes from all sections," quite different from statements made earlier. The Advocate was really a very militant paper. They fought very strongly for rights. And this is, as I said, this is all digitized. All the surviving issues are digitized and available on Chronicling America right now. So we're in Fayette County. Adjacent to Kanawha County, published 4 papers in 3 towns. The most significant of these papers was the Sentinel, a religiously affiliated paper edited by Milton S. Malone and published in Red Star. Malone would also try his hand at publishing a paper called The Miner in 1912 in nearby Hilltop. It is believed that the minor only lasted a few months, possibly a year. Regardless of the length of publication, not a single issue of either paper is known to survive. Red Star and Hilltop are located within 3 miles of each other in Fayette County, and that would prove to be important for the long life of the Sentinel, a Baptist paper published weekly on Saturdays from 1904 to 1923, with a significant subscriber base of 1,500. That's really very significant for this time period. Nearby Hilltop, a 3-minute drive from Red Star today, was the home of the West Virginia Seminary and College, established by the Reverend J.R. Perkins, a Baptist minister, in 1901. The Sentinel would have found a ready reception throughout the state and among the faculty at the seminary, which provided elementary, high school, industrial, and theological training. 2 papers in Fayette County were published by the Reverend Dr. CH Payne, and he is truly a significant figure. Payne was also a community leader. He was a minister, an educator, and the first African-American elected to the West Virginia legislature. As a newspaperman, Payne published 3 newspapers in West Virginia: the West Virginia Enterprise, which we will talk more about shortly, in Charleston, the Pioneer, and the Mountain Eagle. Little is known about the Pioneer or the Mountain Eagle. Both papers were published in Montgomery, both during the 1890s to 1900s. No issue from either paper is known to exist. So here's a page from the West Virginia Enterprise. Although published in Kanawha County, I mention it here because it's one of Payne's papers. We can still learn a lot about newspapers even when so few issues survive. Only the first 3 issues, September 12, September 19, September 26, 1885, of the West Virginia Enterprise survive. But we can learn many things about Black newspapers from its pages. The first page, September 19, 1885, we learn that the price for a single copy is 5 cents. The first page is what the newspapers termed, and I quote, interesting reading. And this is interesting for us when we think about newspapers today in comparison to newspapers of the 1880s. Use of catchy headlines to attract attention was very common on the first page, whereas we, of course, put the most important news on the front page. That wasn't the case at all then. So today we might consider this interesting reading to be tabloid-style content. Headlines included, and here's some from the first page of the West Virginia Enterprise: Pungent Paragraphs, a collection of odd notes. The Hornet, descriptions of an interesting insect. And my favorite, Our Dead Presidents, how they died and where they're buried. So this is what's on the first page of the West Virginia Enterprise. But the second page contained the real news related to the subscribing population. The third issue, September 26th of 1885, had important news with a headline titled Facts for Colored Voters. The fact that the important news relating to African Americans appeared on the second page and interesting news took the front page was not uncommon at all. It followed a long-standing newspaper tradition, even going back as far as the Civil War. Second page, third issue, serves as an introduction to the Enterprise. So in the third issue, they put a couple of issues out. In the third issue, they decide to say, this is a going concern. We haven't just done 2. We're going to do a lot more. So it describes itself as a new paper. And I quote, a handsome 6-column folio full of news, and there's that interesting reading again, unquote. There was a blurb too. The West Virginia Enterprise is the name of a new colored paper published in Charleston, West Virginia by Reverend CH Payne. We wish it success. And this is from the People's Advocate in Richmond, Virginia. This was very common. Other newspapers often announced the debut of a new paper. Whether they were white papers or black papers, they would announce the debut of a new paper. And frankly, that's how I learned about most papers, is from these little snippets that announce the debut of a new paper. So now we're to Cabell County. 9 newspapers are known to have been published in Huntington during the late 1880s through the early years of the 1920s. And this is the biggest time span for Black newspaper publication. The 1880s I'd say up to 1930 maybe, but mostly up to 1925. Little is known about most of the papers published in Huntington. The Industrial Messenger made temperance part of its mission. C.H. Barnett, a teacher and editor of the West Virginia Spokesman, was fired by the school board for his paper's political stance, and it was forced to close. The Huntington Enterprise is the only known paper to survive today, with a single issue which will be digitized during this grant cycle. So these newspapers documented an extraordinary time in Huntington's history, a time referred to as a Black Renaissance, a period of intellectual and cultural significance for Huntington's African American community. So here is the sole surviving issue of any of the Huntington newspapers. And we have it at WVU. It's an actual issue like this Wheeling Post is. And again, we'll be digitizing this one issue during this grant cycle. The date is May 15, 1920. Contents of this issue include news on political candidates, world events, and an announcement for an upcoming NAACP meeting to be held at Huntington's Frederick Douglass High School Monday, May 17. The announcement above the NAACP meeting includes news of a lecture by General Leonard Wood on Friday, May 21. Wood was most likely in Huntington to campaign for his presidential run in the 1920 election. As a candidate, Wood was a well-known Republican from New Hampshire whose military career included service as the Army's chief of staff, as well as military governor of Cuba and governor general of the Philippines. In fact, at the Republican National Convention just a couple of months later in June, Wood's popularity was so great that he was tied with Governor Frank Orrin Loudon of Illinois for the nomination. However, Warren G. Harding secured the nomination and went on to win the election, as we all know, serving as our 29th president. These headlines reveal just two of the major stories that ran in the Huntington Times and, of course, other African American newspapers. So, Ohio County, 7 papers are known to have been published here, all in Wheeling. John Mullen of Lost History Associates, who was an earlier speaker for this program, has made great strides in identifying Wheeling's Black papers, and they're available on his blog post. And then here is the Wheeling Post. Thanks to Laura Carroll, the head of Adult Services, Assistant Director and Archivist here at the Huntington County Public Library, I learned about the Wheeling Post just in the last couple of weeks, published in the 1990s. I'm really excited about this. This was a paper completely unknown to me, and it adds another paper to the long list of newspapers that we are building for Black newspaper history. Wood County. Only 4 papers are known, and notice that I stress are known. I have found 48 or 49 papers. We have found 48 or 49 papers. We have not found them all. More are going to be out there. I don't know how long it will take us to find them all, if we ever will, but there will be more. So these 4 papers were published in Parkersburg. And when I say 4, I know you're looking at this going, Stewart can't count because there's only 3 here. But the West Virginia Freeman changed its name to the Freeman. They dropped the West Virginia part, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So I'm counting that as 4. Reverend George Fountain, a prolific founder of at least 6 newspapers throughout the state, published Fountain's Digest for at least 8 years. Fair Play is known only by title and publishing company. That's one I found as I was searching newspapers, and I've never found another bit of information about it since then. But that doesn't mean I won't. Hopefully, keep our fingers crossed, I'll be able to. But a great deal is known about the West Virginia Freeman / Freeman. So the West Virginia Freeman was established in 1881. This is the very top of our date range that's known now. It was not a race paper per se, and that's defined as a newspaper specifically dedicated to the concerns of the Black community, but a temperance paper, totally dedicated to the cause of alcohol prohibition. Temperance was very strong in West Virginia at that time. But beginning in 1886, the state affiliation, West Virginia, was dropped from the title and the paper became the Freeman. Under this title, the paper continued until 1881. Both iterations of the paper found a ready audience. The state of West Virginia was strongly in support of the temperance movement. Both the West Virginia Freeman and the Freeman are digitized and available on Chronicling America. And with the West Virginia Freeman, we have the very first issue, and that's really extraordinary. The very first issue of any paper almost never survives. So to have the first one of this is really terrific. Now, McDowell County. Founded in Keystone in McDowell County, a county known across the U.S. today as the worst county in the nation for age expectancy, health, and drug use. The McDowell Times, established in 1904, served as a leading newspaper when coal was king. Published weekly, the Times offered a unique glimpse into the state's laboring African American communities, its Republican politics, founded on the party of Abraham Lincoln, and the intersection of race and class in the coal fields. The driving force behind the McDowell Times was its editor, Matthew Thomas Whitaco, an educator who moved to Keystone and purchased a local newspaper, renaming it the McDowell Times. It was the McDowell Herald before, and that was a white paper. Born in Virginia immediately following the Civil War, Whitaco attended Lincoln University, a black college in Pennsylvania. After graduation, he taught school in his home state. Whitaco, the McDowell Times, an important political paper, belonged to the National Negro Press Association and reported events sponsored by the NAACP. From a political standpoint, the McDowell Times was the most important black newspaper in the state. Like many African Americans in this era, Whitaco was a staunch Republican in the party of Lincoln, and the McDowell Times reflected its editor's politics. Whitaco used his publishing pulpit to espouse Republican politics to African Americans in the county and region. McDowell County was unique in West Virginia because of its sizable black population, many of whom labored in the coal fields. So, with no small pride, the Times declared, and I quote, "Negroes are very important political factors in the county. They are more thoroughly organized than in any county south of New York." And the Times played no small part in this organization with a wide-reaching circulation of nearly 5,000. That's really a phenomenal circulation. The political clout of the county's African-American community was evidenced by Whitaco's election to Keystone City Council, and Whitaco's growing importance to the Republican Party was evidenced by his service on the party's state executive committee. Okay, so now we're headed to Berkeley County. And while there's only a couple of papers here, one of the most important is also here. And among the earliest black newspapers in West Virginia was J.R. Clifford's Pioneer Press. This paper was published for over 30 years. The subscription base was nationwide and international in scope. Despite its long run, surviving issues on microfilm of the Pioneer Press only cover the years 1911 to 1917, and it began in 1883. The few original newspaper issues that survive are from the 1880s. All the surviving issues have been digitized and are available on Chronicling America. So this is great. You can read all these papers for free at home. It's really wonderful. You can download them, research them. It's really a terrific, terrific program. So J.R. Clifford was a man of many talents and abilities. Clifford was a graduate of the first West Virginia institution of higher learning for African Americans at Storer College in Harpers Ferry. He was a Civil War veteran and the first African American attorney in West Virginia. A colleague of W.E.B. Du Bois, Clifford was a key figure in the Niagara movement, a precursor of the WACP. And the most important meeting of the Niagara movement was held in West Virginia at Storer College. And Clifford is the one who put that together. So this is a sad tale and yet a happy one. This is all that remains of the Kanawha advance. This is it. And this was another one of those really exciting moments when just this fragment, when I learned just this fragment survived. It was established and edited by R.B. Robinson, a paper of very short duration. Little is known other than what was listed in Ayer's newspaper directory, published at the time, and a single surviving clipping pictured here, accompanied by a letter written by Robinson, now owned by the Beinecke Library at Yale. According to Ayers, the Kanawha Advance was established in 1885, an independent paper with no political affiliation, published weekly on Saturdays. However, the West Virginia Freeman, on July 16, 1884, introduced the Kanawha Advance as a new journal. And journal is a term that was often used interchangeably with the word newspaper. So newspapers often referred to other newspapers as journals, and vice versa. It was as published in Charleston with a typo, B.B. Robinson, it's R.B. Robinson, who was described by the Freeman as, and I quote, a colored brother from Virginia. Until this clipping surfaced in a bookseller's catalog, this newspaper was completely unknown, not just to me, but it was a totally new paper to anyone looking at West Virginia papers. And this clipping is all that remains. And I can't tell you how grateful I am that there is this clipping. So, researching newspapers, let me talk a little bit about what it's like to research these papers. It would be truly difficult to do this research without the wide array of digitized resources available. The papers do not survive. So without the digitized sources, it would be really hard to track these down. The newspapers themselves are the most important resource. West Virginia newspapers, digitized and available on the Library of Congress newspaper portal, Chronicling America, are keyword searchable, free to read and download. Other important sources are also available online. These include what I just mentioned, N.W. Ayers & Sons American Newspaper Annual and its successor, N.W. Ayers & Sons American Newspaper Annual and Directory. This was a long-standing business that was in the habit of finding advertisements, newspapers to advertise in from lots of different advertisers. And so they went out and searched for newspapers in each state. They were very thorough, though they did miss a few things if you go through all of them, as I have. But they're very thorough, and I learned about a lot of newspapers that I would not have known about had it not been for the research in the 1880s and 19-teens that Ayers Newspaper Directory did. Also, the West Virginia Blue Book, published by the West Virginia Legislature. I was delighted to find out that the West Virginia Blue Book, you've seen those West Virginia Blue Books, hundreds of blue volumes that say Blue Book on it. Those are fabulous resources for all kinds of West Virginia history. And every time it was published, they did a section on newspapers published in the state. So that was a great resource. Another excellent resource was the report of the Bureau of Legal Welfare and Statistics that has not been digitized, but it is available at the West Virginia and Regional History Center at the WVU Downtown Library. And there are so many other sources that I have not mentioned, which are digitized and also physical books. Keywords are also very important. Unless you use the right keywords, your ability to find what you're looking for is more difficult. Terms that were acceptable at the time these newspapers were published are necessary to yield a successful search. So here's some of the challenges that I ran across. And that is, many newspaper titles were duplicated for both white and black newspapers. It takes some persistence to determine which of the 3 West Virginia Enterprise newspapers is the one that you're looking for. Knowing the editor is really key to that. If there are 3 West Virginia Enterprises, you get really excited and then find out that's not the one you're looking for. A lack of information is another challenge. This clipping conveys just enough to inform the reader that an African-American newspaper was started in Elkhorn. So right down here at the very bottom, where it says Negroes have established a Republican newspaper at Elkhorn, that's it. I've never found anything else out. Neither the names of the founders, the editors, nor the paper itself are noted. We still hope to discover the name of this newspaper, but right now, that's all. This is all we have. Hopefully it will emerge at some time. And that's how most of these little blurbs like this are how I have gotten most of my information. Most of them have a name or an editor's name, which is very, very helpful. This one, not so much. So, a few of the reference works consulted shown here fail to recognize West Virginia's African American newspapers. Only the McDowell Times and the Pioneer Press are listed in any of these reference works. That may be because these papers were among the most important and the most long-lived in the state. But that's not all. Even things printed at the time don't get it right. So here is a very prominent book that people continue to use for research today. This is Men of Mark, Eminent, Progressive, and Rising. So information from this time period when the newspapers are being published needs to be taken with a grain of salt. Information about the West Virginia Enterprise listed in this book is recorded incorrectly. It states that Payne's paper was the only African-American weekly newspaper in West Virginia, and this is simply not true. Clifford's Pioneer Press was also a weekly that began 2 years before the West Virginia Enterprise. And since these are weeklies, let me say that there was not one single daily African-American newspaper in the state. They were all weeklies or a monthly, and that speaks loudly to subscriber base and advertisers. If you do not have the sizable subscriber base or the number of advertisers, you are unable to go beyond a weekly publication. So, as of right now, on Chronicling America, the West Virginia Freeman, the Advocate, the McDowell Times, and the Pioneer Press are fully digitized and available right now. In this grant cycle, which ends in 2024, I almost said 2014 there, 2024, the West Virginia Enterprise, the Huntington Times, the West Virginia Weekly, the West Virginia Digest, and the Clarion from Clarksburg will be digitized. So, what else can you see on Chronicling America? With a total of 106 West Virginia newspapers digitized, you can find papers printed during the Civil War, on the oil and gas industry in West Virginia, documenting the mine wars, black papers, of course, and soon there will be papers documenting the timber industry. So we try to pick a theme for each grant cycle and work on that and try to pick specific counties so that we'll eventually cover the entire state. These newspapers serve as resources for genealogical searches, family news, historical people and events, class instruction, as well as poetry and literature and short stories by famous authors that you might not be able to find any other way. And so my last slide to bring us to the end, you can help. If you know of any papers, if you know of any surviving issues, please let me know. This is how you've learned today that I found out about the Wheeling Post. I had no idea about that before. Every little bit helps. If you know of a paper or know of an issue, please contact me. I want to digitize everything that I can find and make it available to everyone for free on Chronicling America. And I would so appreciate your help. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Yes?
I noticed one of these papers had a man of white race as the editor, or maybe the owner. I'm
Yes.
curious what the criteria for classifying something as an African American.
Simply because there was a white editor, and I believe there was more than one, but I haven't fully documented that yet. I can think of another paper where I'm pretty sure the editor was also white, but I don't have all the information to proclaim that right now. But things often worked.
Is it ownership or audience that would classify it as an African American?
You know, it could be both, but it could be specifically, and I believe it's more specifically audience, that it is aimed at an African American audience.
Is there examples of white publishers who publish African American newspapers to tap into that specific audience? you understand my question?
I do understand your question, and not that I am aware of in West Virginia. That does not mean that that has not occurred, but I don't believe that's the case in West Virginia, or I haven't found that out yet. Certainly.
Well, the business model of the newspaper is subscribers and advertisers as far as revenue stream. I was wondering how the white community, is there examples of the white community supporting the African American newspaper because they advertise or whatever in the newspaper?
Earlier on, there really wasn't white advertisers. There was a huge struggle. If there were advertisers, more papers would have been able to last longer than a few months or a year, as many of the earliest ones were. Advertisers were gaining advertisers was a real problem. But later on, particularly with J.R. Clifford's Pioneer Press, that is heavily documented that white readers subscribed and read the paper all across the United States and internationally. It was a very successful paper reaching all audiences.
I was thinking maybe they were more dependent on classified ads as opposed to ads from merchants that were more business owned by that was just what I would assume. Maybe that this was the case.
Yeah, I think more research should probably be done on NW Ayers newspaper directory. I did learn that I wondered at first when I discovered that resource whether the papers themselves sent the announcement to Ayers in order to be included, or if Ayers did and it's spelled Ayers, if Ayers actually did the work themselves. And it turns out that they had an agent that they used specifically to comb the nation and gather this documented evidence. Though I did read a statement in one of their digitized booklets that they did welcome you sending in information, but their goal was to do it themselves. They wanted as full a coverage as they could acquire. So, and that's purely for advertising. They wanted to match up advertisers with newspapers. But that was much later on. It really is later 19th century to earlier 20th century.
Thank you.
Certainly, yes.
So once the papers are digitalized, are they then preserved?
Yes. Yes, most of it.
No, the paper themselves are they preserved?
Yes, we still have many physical papers, but a lot of it is on microfilm only. So a lot is not here. And papers were digitized at WVU as early as the 1950s. So that's a little before my time, and I can't answer as to what happened to them then. But and I've been around for a while there. But
The paper deteriorating over time, but it's still nice to see the actual document.
yes, and that's a really great topic to talk about is whether the paper deteriorates over time or not. The earlier papers do not. Their paper is better quality, but when you get a little later on, there's a heavy wood pulp content, and that they totally just fall to pieces. Yes.
Doing your research, did you find thing content in the newspapers? Growing up, we were always like the newspapers in our community were like announcing things that were going on besides social. Some of us political, some of it was also written in code. Did you find anything or any special content?
I don't know anything about the code, and maybe that's because I don't know about the code. Maybe I need to learn more about that, and I'm not sure where. And if you can point me in the right direction, that would be great. But yes, papers were very interested in political stances. The McDowell Times, the Advocate, the Pioneer Press, these were very engaged in politics, very driven newspapers. The West Virginia Freeman was totally focused on temperance. Really, they talked about nothing else but temperance, and they had such a long run. It's pretty amazing that they had a pretty good subscriber base for that. But really, the African American newspapers covered everything just like every paper does today. They were very engaged in political and civil rights and uplift as well.
some point in time they had somebody had read the Pittsburgh Courier.
Yes.
There were information served at certain times, not to go in this certain area at certain times, and different things like a guidance for our community.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that, so thank you for telling me about that. Yes.
Yes, I didn't know if this was too early or recent, but did they publish for schools of the blind?
For Schools of the Blind?
Yeah, did they publish for schools that were,
Oh,
because there was black schools of the blind.
right.
You know,
There
in
were.
the state, and not just in our state, but I'm wondering if at this time, did they publish for blind at all?
You know, that's a great question, and in my research, I have not found that to be the case at all. That does not mean it did not occur, but publishing for the blind in Braille, I don't really know how that process works, but I would think it would take a different kind of material perhaps a paper, but a different kind of material to do that. But I hate to say it, I don't know. I'll have to look for that though. Thank you.
I have an online question.
Okay, great.
From Chuck Hilliard. We wanted you to compare the quality of digitization of Chronicling America versus other commercial, like Advantage Archive.
I don't know Advantage. I'm not familiar with that, but to be honest, because Chronicling America is free, newspapers.com and other sources take the Chronicling America content and upload it to their site. So that happens quite frequently. So I'd say it's pretty much the same.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you.